mythological.
I think yeah, let's say let's like fully parody the slasher genre in which like it's a gaggle of new gods in Olympus who are young and decide to go to Tartarus, right? Uh where is that where the old like Titans are sealed away, I think,
Mhm.
and decide to, do some little classic like irresponsible teen stuff down there, and they awaken the Titans who are now killing
Oh,
off the gods of Olympus.
so cool.
I will throw you animal based.
Um, all right. Can you throw me an animal too?
uh, and your animal is a wolf.
Um, yeah, this is like a pack. Oh, you can this. This is a reverse werewolf slasher.
Ooh.
So this is a totally animal based story where everyone is an animal in an animal society, but during the daytime, one of the animals is turning into a human and just like shooting people or shooting the other animals.
Yeah.
So there's a one sneaky hunter there who wants to hunt humans and is wearing an animal pelt, whereas all the other animals are normal animals.
I've been trying to solve the problem of love. It's my pleasure queer. So I turn to my God above. Measure theory.
Hello, and
Things
welcome
that
to another
drive
episode
me
of
quite
Muprov
wild.
Musings. This is episode 59. I'm one of your hosts, Hal Munger, and joining me now on the line is your unusual host, Julian Bernardo.
Yeah, you see, I'm a bit unusual. I tear up my tissue boxes. This is real. I tear up my tissue boxes when I'm done with them and just have like little remnants of tissue box. I just like to be doing something with my hand typically, and the tissue box is always at my desk where I'm sitting. So I'm always sitting here whittling away or ripping apart the tissue box. So thank you for bringing a light to my unusual nature, Hal.
You're welcome, Julian. And what unusual plan do you have for today?
Well, this is quite an unusual episode in that we've been having a lot of fun talking about slashers and how to do an improvised slasher this season, but we also want to somewhat broaden our horizon of what it means for a film or a story to be a slasher. So we're focusing all today on doing non-traditional slashers. So we've watched some movies that are kind of in this realm of yeah, you could kind of see that that might be considered a slasher, but definitely are not considered like always within the slasher canon.
So Julian watched Alien, and I watched Jaws and The Thing.
Yeah, right. And so just think about those. You can see like all of those involve some sort of monstrous creature type thing who might be whittling down a cast. Yet they all have features that are different enough that people don't consider them within the slasher canon. One thing that I'll just say immediately, people talk about in a way to exclude these is some people, when talking about slashers, have a certain definition for what kind of slasher counts as a slasher, and often people like put some sort of restriction on like it must be a demented person or something like that, which is which might be true of explaining the broad strokes of slasher movies, but I think Hal and I agree that it's a lot of fun to consider different kinds of slashers, right?
Yeah, there's nowhere in the rule book that says that a dog can't play basketball. And
Yeah.
my attitude, at least, especially after watching Jaws, was that unless you had a rule specifically saying the slasher cannot be a shark, uh, I don't think that there's any way to consider Jaws not a slasher because there's no way where the slasher is allowed to be a shark where you could make a movie that was more slasher than Jaws.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel the exact same about Alien. It's so by the books a slasher. And yeah, I think that genre should be defined mostly just on the. I don't. It seems limiting to only consider things that maybe fall within certain like plot contents to be certain things. When I feel like genre is maybe more about like structure and the like feelings that it gives you.
But in general, the question that all of this brings in itself is why and when should you break your improv form? So regardless of what improv form you're doing, whether it's the most rigid of, Harold-esque kind of thing, or whether it's the most loosey-goosey new play open world thing, when is the moment to break from the thing that you've been practicing and embark on something that never has been practiced before on stage?
Yeah, this will be, I think, pretty broadly applicable to any kind of format you do because that's always a question. I think that it's typically not talked about when you're doing like a format, at least to any great length of when is it acceptable to break the format and to what degree is it acceptable to break the format. And whenever you do talk about these things, I feel like it is always a conversation that is very specifically zoned in on the format that you're doing at that time. Whereas I think hopefully by the end of this episode, we can talk through just general principles for why or why not it might be good to break certain formats.
And I think it's on the director to communicate that
Totally.
because
Yeah.
people genuinely feel pretty different about it. And I've been in some situations where half the cast is excited to break the form and half the cast really wants the form to stay the same. And you
Yeah.
get these weird shows where it starts to break because some people are pushing it in that direction. And then it has to weirdly be clawed back into shape. And that's the worst of both worlds. So getting on the same page about what kind of form breaks you're okay with and how you feel about it is a good thing. Personally, Julian, how do you feel about it?
I on the spectrum from 1 being always break the form to 10 being never break the form, I really do feel like I'm somewhere in the middle. I see the potential in breaking the form, but I do like, especially when you're doing like narrative long form, there's certain things about if you know how the show is going to go, you can start scenes in a way that is setting up certain types of plot or whatever. And so if that gets broken, I guess I'm sometimes not happy, but maybe I'll revise it to say, I feel like I've been most unhappy when it gets broken and there's no like shared consensus for what to do in this case, aka the director hasn't really communicated to us what to do when we get off course.
Yeah, I think my attitude is that from 1 to 10, if 1 was you should always be allowed to break the form, and 10 is you should never be allowed to break the form. I'm definitely a 1. But I
Yeah.
feel like always breaking the form doesn't even really make sense because at
Yeah.
that point there is no,
Right.
there is no form.
Yeah, it's like there's an ideological part of me that's like I think that people in general often like too soon get to that question of like, oh, like yeah, let's like try thinking about it in this like off the angle way, which think about it in these like strange ways, like these formats, like how they can be different. It is super helpful and is like a nice way to understand what the format is. But I think I tend to want people to drill down the basics of what's already been learned rather than go and trying out new things.
That makes sense as a director to not want to waste the time. I think for me, it comes down to like different types of learning and the difference between sort of like rote learning and memorization of a specific structure, and the difference between actually learning it so that you understand it well enough to understand which are the important points and the ways in which you're capable of breaking it. And I feel like the second one is always the type of learning that I prefer. Um, and if you learn in the first way, then when you're in a situation where things start to go off the rails, you won't be equipped to deal with that. And I've definitely seen a lot of that in New York. I feel like a lot of things are taught very much in the first way, where it's like, here is what's going to happen. And this is it. We've learned how to do narrative by following this very specific rule book.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree with what you say, and I think that maybe let's start to structure it, which is that we kind of have some downsides and upsides to breaking forms, and I think let's just maybe go through more generally how we feel about this, because yeah, I agree that it does teach you something if you're able to understand what parts of the format would persist even in a different setting.
The first downside is often some of the worst shows.
Yeah, right. I mean, all like differing from the format just creates confused improvisers, creates miscommunication sometimes, creates, bad shows. I think that that's natural. But the first upside is that it often creates some of the most memorable shows.
And then those kind of go hand in hand, but they're not always the same. So sometimes it creates a terrible show that, is memorable for being terrible. And sometimes it creates an awesome show that's memorable for being awesome. And sometimes it creates a terrible show that isn't,
Yeah.
they're not, the terribleness is not necessarily what's making it memorable. So another
Right.
way to do this, it might just be say introduces more risk.
Yeah, it's a high variability play to throw into your improv show.
Um, and specifically, I think that it's a high variability, low expected value play.
Sure. Perhaps. Oh, it just depends on, your how suited your crew is to ripping these genre mixes.
Yeah, it does depend on that. But I think that, well, that's another thing where if you are putting out a show that is already kind of on the brink of not that good, increasing your variability and lowering your expected value is probably not what you want to do. But if you're reliably turning out a show that's very, very good, that
Yeah.
might be a way to start pushing into the next level because even if you lower the expected value a bit, you're still not going to have these like utter disaster shows.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, yeah, it's fair to say that it probably hurts more than it helps in terms of that expected value comment.
I,
And,
but the flip side of that is for learning. I feel like it's really useful to see some of these disasters and to be playing in this higher risk way. I think will make you learn faster. So if
yeah.
your goal is to have a group that's going to put on an amazing show a year from now, and you have a small audience size that you don't care, like you're not as focused on that, I would recommend doing weird stuff and learning from it.
The kind of second round of things, one downside that makes it, yeah, I think like maybe overall in general, like a worse show is maybe this hat on a hat concept or like you're doing too much. Uh, Often it's enough kind of material to work with having one genre. I mean, that's just typically there's enough to work with there. Whereas if you're doing, and right now I'm talking about genre because one of the big ways that we think about bending these genre-based formats is introducing maybe two genres at the same time. So if we think about that concept, if you have two genres in your show, it's so much to work with, and there's a great potential for neither of those parts of the show to feel like they were fleshed out in any real way because both of them exist and neither of them get the space to breathe. And so that's one way in which this can just become a downside.
Yeah, I agree with that. One downside to not breaking the form is that you'll never, know what your best possible thing is. So it's the same downside that exists across all scripted theater. It's inherently limiting. You're not going to discover stuff. You will like maybe achieve mastery over something and be more and more repetitive. But at that point, it begs the question, why are you improvising? And maybe it's I like this specific middle ground between script and unscript. And that's where I'm happiest. And it doesn't have to be like the extremes that win the day. But
I think to riff more on upside, something I have written here that I think generally there's something to be said is that it keeps the show spontaneous in a way, and not just like the reason that I preface this thought is that I feel like there are different meta levels of spontaneity in improv, right? You can have a troupe who has been doing the exact same Herald for the past 20 years and they're really good at it. And every time it's new because they get a suggestion and they do something different. But at the first meta level, it's very not spontaneous. It's very much the same. And while they're still doing improv, there's something in me, some ideological thing that tells me that you should also adding spontaneity at the upper meta level will also just help spontaneity at the lower levels. Like it feels like sometimes if you have a group who's doing the same format too much, it just gets old, it gets stale in a way where you're not surprising each other. And I think that one way to introduce like surprising each other back into the formula is to vary the format.
Mm-hmm. Anson was saying that someone else in improv world was saying that a lot of ensembles, their best shows are their first show and their last show, which doesn't quite make sense. You would kind of assume it would be their last show and their second to last show. But just that having the sort of different energy in the air that night with the group can change the way that people play. And that's actually Wilder, who saw my first show and my last show with the Stanford Improvisers, just was like, oh, my favorite two shows, and just listed them. And I was like, what? That's crazy. But I think that, yeah, like what you're saying, it affects the shows that don't go off the rails because there is this risk. And I think also in the D&D context, or how Sam is like, yeah, in some of the shows, both the protagonists die. And that's a terrible, like those shows probably are a fair amount worse than the shows where both the protagonists live. Mm-hmm. But it adds this sense of risk to it for the players, where I've been in multiple D&D shows where the characters died and I was pretty sure that they weren't going to be able to come back, and then somehow the audience was able to save them with one of their spells or something like that. But it just causes people to play in a much riskier way, and it might actually be worth having one show that sucks to make it so that there is this added tension in your other shows.
I love what we're getting into here, because I think that this does touch on one of the ways that we think about improv that is refreshing and interesting to me, which is this percentage or like random variable breakdown of what an improv show should be, where we are considering improv in the broad set of like some sequence of shows rather than any particular show on its own, and that there are certain things you can do within the sequence that might not be good for that show itself, but might overall increase the value of the sequence. I think this is a true but very interesting idea.
I love this is another thing that Anson was getting mad at me for. I was teaching the 3-day workshop on improvised Shakespeare, and my goal was for them to be able to put on a good show the night of the third day. And I've just kind of noticed that sometimes having a bad show before a good show is helpful. And I've also noticed that like sometimes getting like this ordeal thing of like getting stressed out and then being like, well, let's not do that is helpful. So I intentionally made it so that at the end of the second day, we did some things that were really brainy intensive and overthinking and way too difficult. And everyone was feeling like down. And then at the beginning of the first day, it was like, wait, let's try putting that aside and just having more fun and simplifying it in these ways. And then at the end of the first day was just all this like sort of love. It's the third day was just all this sort of loving, like, let's just support each other and relax and not worry about anything. And then we put on the show, and it was like, you kind of have to go over these bumps.
Yeah, nothing exists in a vacuum. And I think it's just natural that we think about how the whole shape of shows exist. I think one of the things, if we start thinking about this though, is it should be implicit, but that you shouldn't break form in most of your shows. Like we said at the top, like there isn't really a form if most of the shows do break form. And so to think about it in this like format percentage theory, I don't know. It should happen enough that people are not surprised by it, but I don't know, like 10% of shows or 15 or something feels like a good range.
This is making me think of for 4 years I worked at a summer camp. There are two things that happened in the summer camp that reminded me of this. One of them is that they started making this programming where some students who were making these little movies would make a weekly choose your own event, a daily choose your own adventure thing that they'd play at lunch. And because the people wanted to shoot it in advance to make it better, they started making it so that the choices, like one of them was obviously better than the other. And the episodes started getting better and better because they were planning them earlier in advance and shooting them earlier in advance. And they were on the finale episode where they'd made something like really, really awesome that the person had spent like a really long time working on. And the option was like, have the epic final bite or sit in silence for 3 minutes and do nothing. And the whole crowd erupted for sit in silence for 3 minutes and do nothing. I don't know whether like someone planted that seed, but the person who made the video was so mad. And the next day, it was just the silent people sitting, and everyone was going wild, and it was really fun. But if you did that every time, it would suck.
So these little stories, though, they show that the audience often is hunting for this, for throwing the improvisers off, off their game, do something. Anybody who's on stage, they want to see them kind of not necessarily fail or falter, but they want to take them outside of their comfort zone. And especially us as improvisers, we are putting that target on our own back. We're saying we can do a show no matter what happens. And so I think that it's very delightful to audiences when we do break form. And they, like, often audiences' suggestions, for example, can be, I'm not a fan of that. It's trying to be too funny, whatever. But some of those you let through if they're not just like egregiously, crazy. Like if it's a horror show and someone starts throwing out, some of these other genres that we're going to talk about, like someone throws out like, oh, this should be like a Western, then be open to accepting that and doing it, because it's also one of these big shows to the audience of, oh yeah, no, we can do whatever, which is great.
Yeah, and I don't think the audience wants you to fail. I think that they want it not to be predestined that you'll succeed.
Right. Yeah,
so what they actually want is for you to genuinely overcome something on stage, and once they can sort of smell that predestination, then they start to get ruffled up and wanting something different.
But they love the wins, right? So yeah. Like it's like exactly like you say, that once they I guess on the flip side, once they realize that it's not predestined, once they realize that you are all on your toes, then I think once you get your win and you make it all come together, they love it. They go crazy for it. They do have like a real BS detector of whether this is kind of a preordained or a hard fought win.
Mm-hmm. It's similar to like a bottle episode, like in BoJack, there's that episode that's entirely silent, which I didn't think was very good. But then there's also the episode that's just a speech at a funeral of a cartoon horse just talking for the whole episode. And it's like, it's my favorite episode, just because it's so daring.
So yeah, I love these bottle episodes. Shout out to The Fly and Breaking Bad. I think we're delving very hard into this breaking forms concept, and there's a great conversation, but let's maybe lasso ourselves a bit more to non-traditional slashers as a concept.
Yeah, let's dive specifically into some of the ones that we saw. Mm-hmm. I want to start with Jaws, because I thought Jaws was awesome. I had so much fun watching it. And it's basically exactly a slasher. Like literally it starts out with two people, and there are going to be tons of spoilers. Two people like on a beach, like sort of having sex, and one of them's drunk and the other goes into the water and gets eaten by a shark. So it's like, it already has those kind of cringe tropes of a slasher, but it follows a pretty similar kill pattern to the other slasher shows that we've seen. There are like 3 or 4, I forget which one, kills by the shark. I think it's 3. And then the remaining time in the movie is spent in this sort of one-on-one escaping back and forth with this shark.
So just explain this to me as someone who has never seen Jaws. Like, what is the action of this, right? Like the Jaws is in the water. Like what's happening?
So at the start, people don't know that there's a shark in the water. So it's just a person swimming gets chomped.
Yeah. Okay.
And then there's tension building by putting more people in the water, and you're not sure which of them is going to get chomped.
Sure.
And then slowly people start, at the beginning, the town is very much trying to conceal it because they want their beaches open. So they're like, oh, no, it wasn't a shark. And people go swimming again. And then someone gets chomped. And then they catch like a little shark. And they're like, oh, look, we caught it. Like, go back in. And then, so there's this kind of, and some people, there's this fake out scare. Someone pretends to be a shark. People get eaten. There's a lot of shark stuff, but in very slasher form. And then where it differs from the slasher is that rather than having one protagonist do the final thing, there are three protagonists who do the final thing, which is that these three fun characters decide to go out in a boat to hunt the shark, and they're offered $10,000 if they catch it. And one of them is very Captain Ahab-esque and has been hunting sharks his whole life because he has this crazy backstory about, I won't spoil it, but he gives a crazy monologue about his experience with sharks.
Well, it's very interesting the way you describe it, especially given the Jaws is like I just looked it up, 1975, which is pretty like it's post Texas Chainsaw, but it is very very much before the canon of slashers. But the same exact feature of the town wanting to keep the beaches open and having these kind of like limp attempts at like solving the problem and then still going back out into the water, that feels so like slasher-esque of, not necessarily that these people deserve it, but they're kind of bringing it on themselves. Like there's something about the culture that's wrong, and this is like a punishment for it or something.
Well, and the other like big form break besides slasher shark is people intentionally seeking out the slasher, which happens in some slasher movies, but I feel like it reminds me of like adventure, sort of like there's one treasure that you have to discover, a la like 39 Clues or something like that, and people are entering into like this temple of doom or whatever it is and getting picked off by traps and the like. And I think that any sort of elimination movie like that, where people are intentionally getting into trouble, also fits this bill. But then the other answer to your question about how they interact with the shark is that the line of we're gonna need a bigger boat.
Yeah.
They wind up out there in a boat that's like a little too small for what's going on with the shark. And eventually the kind of crazy captain wants to make sure that he is going to be able to interact with the shark, so he destroys their radio technology so they can't call for help to come kill the shark. And then the other thing is they hit the shark a couple times with harpoons that are attached to floating barrels. So the shark is also kind of like clearly on its last legs.
Sure.
So they're both stuck together where their boat is sinking and they need to kill the shark before their boat sinks. Otherwise it's going to eat them. And the shark is trying to destroy their boat just because it's the thing that's attacking them.
Yeah.
It's totally delightful. You'll really like it if you watch it at some point.
Yeah. And this sounds amazing. How improvisable is this?
I think it's actually fairly improvisable. And this gets down to my understanding of it is that they actually somewhat had to, improvise or at least change how they were shooting Jaws because their giant mechanical shark kept on breaking. So towards the end of the movie, there is a lot of shark in a ridiculous way. But at the beginning of the movie and some of the most memorable kills, you really can't see the shark at all. And I think that it would be very hard to break the form to improvise Jaws. But it would be pretty easy to intentionally improvise a shark movie. It would just require a lot of like careful thinking about technical improvisation, sound, and you'd want to conceal the lower half of the stage so that you have people being sucked down below the thing and being pulled around. On an improvisable scale, it gets like maybe like a 6.
Sure.
You could also do like the metaphorical Jaws and Sherlock. There's this character who's like a shark, and just in that his eyes are always blank and he's really creepy. And I think that you could have similar to like when they do Shakespeare in modern times and people like are shooting each other, but they're still like, I stab you. And then they shoot the gun. I think you could have a thing where it's like, there is a shark on the water, but all the scenes of the shark killing someone are played out as a human killing someone.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that would work. That would be interesting. That would make it both artsy and like tense in an interesting way.
All right, Julian, what happens in Alien?
Alien, similar to your opinion on Jaws, I think is just a straight slasher. Like obviously, okay, the main conceit is it's in space on a this like towing ship, and it's an alien rather than like a person killing people. But yeah, I mean, I think it has all the features. I mean, they go to check out this distress signal, and already at this point, there's the same slasher stuff of like, no, we shouldn't go. Let's just go back to Earth. Let's not check the distress signal. But one of the characters is like, no, 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 we have to check it. We have to check it. Sure. And once the alien gets on board, the crew members start to get picked off one by one. There's various like things that they have to do on the ship that makes them kind of split up in ways that the alien gets them. And there are super fun ways that the alien is like killing people. There's like the famous like chest bursting scene, if you know what I'm talking about. And they play with sci-fi stuff in a very fun way as well, beyond just the fact that there's an alien around. Like, I'll just say spoilers ahead, but one of the characters is like an android, but you don't know that until like later on. And like, there's a point at which he's just a head, and they like connect him to the computer, and they're like, what, they're having him explain stuff. So. Yeah, I don't think there's much justification for the fact that this is a slasher, because it also gets down to a final girl interaction with Ripley, and it plays out just like any other slasher would. It's just an alien.
That sounds similar to The Thing as well, but The Thing has a crucial difference, which is that The Thing can imitate people. It's what Among Us is based off of. So there's always a question of which people in the show who are left are The Thing and which people are actually people. And the other thing that's different is that most of the kills happen either in total isolation, you don't see them on screen because you want to keep that tense of who's the thing, or they happen in front of everybody. So whenever people find out who the thing is and decide to kill that thing, in reaction to people attempting to kill it, it leaves its human form and enters its thing form and becomes this very, very gross mass of limbs and tentacles, and usually viscerally kills at least one other character while it's being killed. So it feels very form breaking in that way, in that if you played this as a straight slasher, you would have it just people being isolated with their friend and then suddenly being killed by this. But this group killing in front of people was a very fascinating way to have a slasher that I had never seen before. And usually the reason you can't do that is because there's only one slasher. So if you kill in front of the whole group, that person probably they'll get you. But in this context, you can sort of sacrifice yourself and die, and then there's still another person out there slashing.
What is the setting of this? Is it like is it sci-fi? Is it in the future? Is it where is it?
It's polar. So they're on a tiny research station, and they run into another research station that's already been taken over by the thing. The other thing about the thing is that it has a very famous ambiguous ending, where there are two people left and they're just sort of sitting there together, and it's not clear if either of them is the thing. And Jaws also has a multi-survivor. I won't tell you how many, but it's more than one person survives Jaws, which has a different vibe to it.
Yeah, those seem to be maybe one of the big departure. Alien as a single survivor, but that seems to be one of the things that these tend to change about the slasher format, or the ways that they vary from typical slashers, is maybe not sticking so directly to the final survivor role.
And I think that for an improv context, each of these movies in some ways felt more improvisable than the other slashers that I was watching.
Hmm.
Uh, and mainly because of the degree to which they shared screen time.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just this thing where like the other slashers I watched were really like a duo prov show with a lot of other people got killed. Whereas Jaws, you had this team of three people who was on for a lot, and you had the shark. So it felt more like a normal improv show.
Yeah, and thinking about adapting a slasher to improv, I totally feel like this might be like a necessary thing. Even if you're doing a more straight slasher, I feel like just in terms of the strength of what improv can do versus like film, having people on stage talking to each other is just one of the layups for improv. It's so good at uh, consistently producing interesting scenes where people are talking with each other. So yeah, I think that we should adopt some of these non-slasher things into the slasher format.
hmm Because you could totally do a thing where you killed a bunch of people following the traditional heat map, and then three people survived after that and did the whole escape thing as a team.
Totally. It's interesting thinking about so one of the things I mentioned at the top is that like a slasher is a person, or at least some people say that the slasher has to be a demented person, whatever. Uh, I think these all the examples that we've talked about are not people, and they use the fact that they're not people in different and interesting ways. Honestly, probably the I'll say least interesting of these would be Alien, in that while the xenomorph isn't like a person, it's still like somewhat humanoid, and mostly it's just like moving really crazy and whatnot. But with both The Thing and Jaws, it seems like the physical like embodiment of this thing really influences the way that the story plays out. I would say that The Thing is maybe even the most particular in that it animates the whole plot in terms of you're always trying to figure out who the whether the person is the thing, right?
Yes. So what you can do is uh, you could have a normal slasher follow the thing structure. And it wouldn't quite make sense necessarily of why, but if you wanted to do this thing where it's like some of the kills happen off stage and some of the kills happen in front of everybody, uh, you could have a normal slasher come in and do that and be like, oh, how does this affect how the plot feels? And same with Jaws, you could have a normal slasher be like, what happens if three people survive for a while and are chasing after the slasher?
To zone in a little bit more on The Thing, like we kind of we've sort of built out some of a taxonomy of what non-traditional slashers might look like, specifically like the slasher itself. So like The Thing maybe falls into like the infection style slasher.
Infection or haunting. It's a kind of a mix of both. Uh, but both of these slashers allow everyone in the cast to get to play the slasher, which is really fun. So how does
And
infection work?
yeah, so an infection slasher would be something like maybe a prototypical example would be zombies, where you are maybe not infected for some portion of the plot, and then by coming into contact with something, you become infected, and then you are, on the side of killing and eating your friends or whatever. And this, doesn't have to be zombie as shown here. It can happen in, The Thing does it in a very interesting way, but it allows the people to get killed not to just exist as dead bodies or whatever, but to actually be the slasher essentially.
Yeah, and then haunting is a similar thing. I have John Malkovich written here, where the slasher is a character that doesn't necessarily have a body. Maybe it's a disembodied spirit. But whenever someone's body is being controlled by the slasher, they take on the same mannerisms that have been built up before in the other slashers. So you can tell, like, oh, this is not that character anymore. They're being controlled by the slasher. And those kind of ghostly haunting things also allow everyone in the cast to get to be on stage inhabiting that slasher character in a way that really makes it feel more like a team effort in an improv style than just one person doing their thing.
I think people also love in improv to see people play different characters. So, like, someone is playing like a very studious, like small character, and then plays like a very big, boisterous character later. People really like that, and so taking that lesson, I think people love the concept of someone playing non-haunted and then haunted. That's just like a very like thinking about the tricks that we have on stage of what we can do that is like visually intriguing or just interesting to an audience. I think that is one of our real tricks, is like a massive difference in character in the same actor.
Yeah, some simple ones though are like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, where you just have two personalities inside yourself, and when you tilt your head this way, you're one character. When you tilt your head, and also we always in stage combat do something because it's so receiver oriented. Practice imagining that there is someone trying to possess you against your will and making you stab someone. And how I always like to do this is start out imagining that this person has control over your hand, and make it so that your hand is crossing the room to go grab a knife and stab someone. And then have the whole rest of your body try to stop your hand from doing that. And your hand is going to eventually win. But see if you can physicalize that across the stage. And then you can get into the level of like sometimes it controls your head. And like sometimes you are the slasher, and then they say something that breaks you out of it, and you are able to fight back. And maybe you regain control of just your hand, and you knock the knife out of your other hand, and it continues.
Yeah. This is a little bit off the wall, but I watched Blade Runner this week, and just thinking about a physicalization that's interesting. So the plot of it is that they're hunting down these replicants, which are like robots, and one physicalization that you can totally do on the stage that was just crazy to me was they kill one of the replicants, and she dies, but she dies in a way where like she's like short circuiting as she's dead. So it's, you know, it's like a broken laptop or something. So her like just body is like, you know, like rizzing out in this way, and like she's like has this like dialogue line that she's like hitting like this as a death. And I was like, oh wow, like we've played like the robot in different ways that are fun to see on stage, but that was like a really creepy way to do it that I found engaging.
Yeah, I mean, robot slasher right there is already another one. And that gets into the environmental slasher as well, of like the appliances are trying to kill me sort of thing, of everything is the robot. And I feel like there are a lot of movies that do this. I can't think of any specifically, but where it's like there's a specific thing that you have to get rid of. Like there can't be any iron in like, it's like, oh, we forgot there's like a little bit of iron in the golf club or whatever. And then it's crawling after you trying to whack you or whatever. But that also lets the whole cast, you know, play these different objects that are still part of one big slasher.
Yeah. These are all great solutions to that problem, because it is, you know, it is a bit off like the like mode of improv to have these like people in the show who like only exist for a little bit, and there's different solutions, but I like these solutions. One fun, you know, diversion that I mentioned like towards the beginning of this was like an intermediary stage in the genesis of us improvising these slashers is thinking about like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, for example. That's a movie that follows the structure of a slasher, in that, the kids are getting whittled off. Do they die? Do they not? It's obviously a bit lighter because it's, you know, like a kid's film, but we do have like the slasher himself, Willy Wonka, who is enacting all of this.
Yeah, in the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there was a chapter in which one of the kids got sent to the chocolate slicing room and just got slashed up. And the editor was like, "Dude, you can't put this in your in your book." And
it's also, I guess it's like a little bit of like a moral thing in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as well, where just like slashers, it's the kids who are kind of like bad or doing something wrong that end up getting killed. Like they kind of deserved it in a certain way, where modern slashers might impose something like this as well.
Have you seen Saw?
I saw it like a long time ago, maybe.
Does that also have the moral thing, or is he just killing people for fun because he's like a crazy?
I mean, there's like a million Saws, so I'm sure he veers off the path. But I think the premise is at least that like these people have some like dark secret in their life or something. Like, might not even be that it's like evil, but they're like maybe lying. Like, yeah, there's some moral grounding.
Mm-hmm.
There might be also some usefulness in us talking about how to maybe do some of these things very practically as improvisers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we always, and this is going to be hard to do audibly, but I feel like in slasher season is where we're always talking about how to physically make effects happen because we had such a love of the non-human for slashers and the magic for slashers. It's pretty good to be able to learn how to do most magic powers on stage. And how I always do this is pick a power and then try a couple different ways of doing it. And the more you do that, the more you'll be able to instantaneously enact whatever power anyone says.
Yeah. It's interesting practicing it this way because you're not practicing doing one thing in a specific way. You're kind of practicing this like property of going from power to physicalization.
Mm-hmm. And I think physical improvisers play a huge role in this of like the slasher as conductor, where the slasher's job is to sort of demonstrate through their face and emotions and actions what kind of magical things are going to be happening. And then all the other players are following that sort of lead to make objects float or fly around or make vines leave the slasher's arm and wrap around the person. So having like 5 bodies working as your superpowers.
Yeah, that's slasher with physical improvisers is an interesting territory. I feel like it's slasher's conductor is such a fun concept.
Yeah. And also if you have masks, so the ability for multiple people to sort of become the slasher at once, then you can have the thing where like the slasher's here, you turn a corner and suddenly they're behind you. And like there's this teleporting because it's switching who's playing the slasher, and you're surrounded by 5 slashers at once.
Yeah, I think that one skill that we talk that like maybe covers a lot of these to some degree, but in general, I think is a helpful thing for like enacting horror on stage is practice transformations as one actor, as maybe or maybe not one character, but practice turning into a zombie, practice turning into a werewolf, practice getting possessed by some other person. All of these things I think hit on the weird, like uncanny valley thing when you're watching in the audience of like, oh, like if it's well done, at least like this is interesting to see this person just be entirely different. And it both like widens your physical horizon and contributes to the form and also enables you to maybe try out some of these other non-traditional slasher formats.
Mm-hmm. And so boiling it down as we wind down the episode, are there any general principles that you feel like are kind of true going in as someone who wants to play in this kind of way? What would be some guideposts to bring with you?
And when you say play in this kind of way, like a non-traditional slasher or?
Yeah, or just a form break. I think one of them is like consensually, which is like rather than just not addressing it before the show, make sure that people in your group are kind of okay with that. And if you have to like be like, oh, maybe I want to direct a show where this is allowed, and people are opting in to be in form break city.
Yeah, communication I think is huge. Like I mentioned that I'm most upset with form breaks when it's kind of not communicated to us by the director that this is like allowed, and then we're just kind of like on untrodden territory. I would say, practice it. Just practice it. Like especially if you are a director who says you want this to happen, practice it in practice. And we talk about not. Don't practice specific form breaks, but practice the art of doing a form break. Maybe even as a director, if you're like conducting some sort of run, some sort of like longer run where you're going to talk through things, take a moment to say, oh, let's practice like if right now this thing changed that is not typical of slashers. Like, yeah, let's practice at this point the slasher dies. Like halfway through the story and just see what happens. And it's this high variance thing where maybe there's a good reason that never happens. But you more than that show, since it's in practice, you get the benefit of having played in this domain where the rules are broken.
In The Thing, that would be fascinating if The Thing died halfway through and the audience knew that and the characters didn't. And
Yeah,
they
yeah,
kept on killing each other for the remaining. That would be crazy.
yeah.
Uh,
Form breaks.
oh, clarity is huge. Clarity and simpleness, kind of like what you were saying of the hat on the hat, of being like, once you're in a form break show, you have less. The show has less. I always think about it of like, how much give and balance does the show have? So if the first platform scene is really, really strong and sets up characters well, then the show can afford more sort of goofy, random diversions. Whereas if the first scene is really wobbly, then it needs more to stay on track.
Yeah.
So kind of assessing your show that way. And once you're like, okay, we're making a big form break in the first scene, then keeping the other things very simple, and not going for the joke as much, and just being like, all right, we're gonna limit the number of ways this can go wrong.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good like meter to keep in your head to know where you are on the balance side, and to know that if you are in one of these form breaks, that yeah, like a big push has happened already.
Mm-hmm.
I think form breaks too. It's maybe it varies, but I think I feel relatively fine making this general claim about the way that most people tend to improvise, but I think that people tend to be a bit uncomfortable with form breaks. I think that it is, people love formats and feeling like, because it's such a scary thing to be on stage not knowing what you're going to say. And so clinging tightly onto the concept of a format is understandable. It's the thing that like grounds you. But I do, yeah, I mentioned this, but I do feel like it is ideologically important for us as improvisers to be able to deal with form breaks, and that you just need to go back to your base improv training. I think when faced with this scenario, when you were first doing improv, you didn't know how to be on stage and talk to each other, but you just kind of started doing it and it worked, and there was some magic to that. And I think that you can attain the same magic by, if a form break happens, and I've had this before where my initial reaction is, no, that's not what's supposed to happen right now, we've broken the form, like, and I get upset about it. But then I think it's the most wonderful and the most beautiful when you just go with it. I remember a moment, this wasn't even a form break, but we were doing a hero's journey. It was a sci-fi hero's journey. And it was kind of like late game in the show, but like aliens get introduced for like in a way where like my initial reaction as an improviser is like, oh my gosh, this is like adding a hat on a hat. I don't like this. Like, this is not like fit. This isn't the next place that the story was supposed to go. But I was very much on improv ideology stuff at the time. And I was like, no. I acknowledge this feeling in myself. Let me just fully accept it and see where it goes. And regardless of, how people feel about the show, I thought it was good. It made that show so much more fun and so much more fulfilling for me when I was like, no. Let's not even think about that. I am in this world and this is happening. So what happens next? So I think that it can bring you a lot of peace. And I think that it can bring more cohesion to your shows if you try to adopt more of that mindset.
Yeah. And in that mindset, as someone who loves form breaks, I'll give an example of a time where we broke the form too much, which was when we were doing film noirs. We had a couple of film noirs that went a little bit worse than what we were hoping for. And at some point we realized all the film noirs that so far that we've really liked have been like someone got murdered or something got stolen, and we're solving that mystery. And all the ones that have kind of gone off the rails have been one where the mystery itself was like really weird. For example, there was one where the mystery was that all the animals in the town had 3 legs. And it was like, where are their legs going? And it ended up being that there was a crazy guy who was trying to make a room full of legs, like a leg room or something like that. He wanted more leg room. And he had all these legs on his walls. And it was delightful, but it didn't really work narratively, because it was just so, we spent half the show trying to be like, where are these legs going?
Mystery? Yeah.
Yeah, and towards the end of that run, when we really wanted the last shows to like kind of feel good, we were like, okay, we have broken the form in these ways these past couple nights. Now let's go back to being simple. Let's keep these mysteries just to like, there's a killer or there's something being stolen. And that actually made everyone feel much much safer and happier in a playing space.
Yeah. But it goes back, I think, what you just said to the broader like percentage theory of improv, where we did too much there, but I don't think I would have changed the fact that we were open to diverging in that way, because being open to diverging in that way, if we broaden ourselves now, not from thinking about sequences of like one run of shows in one format, but like different runs of different shows in different formats, then taking some formats to really experiment in a big way and put on these shows that are breaking it. While it might not always work, on average, it might produce like a few shows that are super memorable and might be worth it.
And at the very least, you'll understand why the rules are the rules, which is an important thing.
Yeah.
What happens if you break this rule? Oh, now I know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's enough of form breaking for today. So without further ado, this has been Muprov
Musings. So my sign off is, I talk such a big game. We talk such a big game about being seasoned performers on this podcast, right? We are seasoned performers in some sense in improv. But I had a really nerve-wracking, scary, terrifying performance yesterday that I did, which was performing the song that I wrote for the most low-key event of all time, which is the stats department talent show, which, it's just... Yeah, this isn't like a real performance in the sense that like people paid for tickets or anything. But yeah, it was this song that I wrote that was like about kind of stats. It was like a stats love song kind of thing. And at the talent show, it's like one of the big, it's called Stats Giving, the broader event where most of the department comes out, both professors and students. And yeah, I did my song and it was super scary, but people liked it.
Do you have a recording of the song?
I have someone took a recording of it, so I do have a recording of it.
Would you be okay with people on the podcast listening to it?
Oh my God.
Keep in mind we don't have very many listeners.
That's true. I don't know. I think the song is going to turn into something more real at a certain point. Right now it was a live performance. And so I'll say this, if you email Muprov Musings, we'll give you a video. We're not going to make it public, but if you email us, we'll send you a video.
Oh, because are you okay with me pushing this a little more or no?
Sure, you can push it a little more.
Well, just because it is the form break episode, I thought it would be fun if instead of See Me Now, the opening clip is just the very opening guitar on your song, and then at the end they get to hear.
That could maybe work.
So one of the things that I love about being in a stats department is that we have this like big, rigorous set of vocabulary that we can use for stats terms, but we can also use for just like everyday conversation, right? So for example, like the M36 coffee is high variance, or like I placed a strong prior that Noah wasn't going to show up today. So this is a fun feature of being in a stats department, but there is an unused area of research out there which is applying this more rigorous vocabulary to love songs. So I will present my novel research. I've been trying to solve the problem of love. It's my pleasure queer. So I turn to my God above. Measure theory. The baby's vector must be quite like mine. Correlation must be 0.99.
perturbed by any set of size that I set.